The Roman Empire was built on the backs of enslaved people, and the reality of their lives was far more brutal than any Hollywood movie could capture. Slavery wasn't just a minor footnote in Roman history, it was the foundation of their entire economy and way of life. These human beings had zero rights, owned nothing, and existed solely at the mercy of their masters, who could work them until they collapsed, starve them, torture them, or even kill them for entertainment. Let's dive into what daily existence was actually like for someone trapped in Roman slavery. The work enslaved people performed in Rome went far beyond what most people imagine. They weren't just household servants or field workers. Enslaved individuals did virtually every imaginable type of labor that Romans considered beneath free citizens. The system divided them into urban and rural categories, but the jobs spanned an incredible range. You'd find enslaved people cooking meals, cleaning homes, digging deep into dangerous silver mines, and everything in between. On large country estates, one enslaved person might handle domestic chores in the morning and work as a blacksmith or baker by afternoon. Some even served as guards protecting the very people who enslaved them. Urban enslaved people sometimes found themselves in slightly different roles. Businessmen would force educated enslaved individuals to manage their accounts and oversee their commercial operations. If you'd become enslaved after being captured as a prisoner of war, the government might purchase you for public works. These publicly owned enslaved people fought fires that raged through Rome's crowded streets, maintained public buildings, and grimly, sometimes worked as executioners. Some people spent their entire lives enslaved, born into bondage and dying in it, never knowing freedom. Others had a sliver of hope. Freedom existed as a theoretical possibility, though the path there was treacherous and uncertain. The most straightforward route was manumission, where a master simply granted freedom, often in their will. This act of apparent generosity usually came with strings attached, ceremonies to perform or payments to make. Some people voluntarily sold themselves into slavery to pay off debts, with contracts specifying they'd be freed after a certain period. There was also a peculiar financial instrument called a peculium, essentially an account that enslaved people could control while still under their master's authority. This might contain money or even land, and although the master technically still owned it, enslaved people could sometimes accumulate enough to purchase their freedom. But buying your way out of slavery didn't transform you into a full Roman citizen with equal rights. The process of manumission created a strange in-between status. Formerly enslaved people became clients of their former masters, tied to them through ongoing obligations. They couldn't hold public office or participate fully in civic life. And if you were under 30 years old, you couldn't even attempt to buy your freedom. The Roman jurist Gaius established this age restriction during the 1st century CE, effectively trapping young enslaved people in bondage during what should have been their most productive years. The cruelty of slavery transcended any particular time period or culture, and Roman slavery was absolutely no exception to this universal horror. Masters expected enslaved people to behave perfectly, and the punishments for any perceived misbehavior were the stuff of nightmares. The 2nd century playwright Plautus captured this terror in his work Manumission, where an enslaved character named Masinio voices his fears: whippings, chains, the mill, exhaustion, starvation. Freezing cold, that's the wonderful payment for laziness. I'm terrified of all that. So I'd much rather behave myself than suffer the consequences. I can handle being yelled at, but I really hate being beaten. The casual way this character discusses extreme physical punishment shows how normalized this violence was in Roman society. Slave owners wielded absolute power over the people they enslaved. They could beat them savagely, chain them up, put them in lead irons, and subject them to brutal whippings whenever they felt like it. Masters possessed the legal authority to sell enslaved people away from their families, execute them by hanging or crucifixion, and assign them the most degrading and dangerous tasks imaginable as punishment. If an enslaved person attempted to escape, they'd be branded with a hot iron, permanently marking their skin as a warning to others and ensuring they could never hide their status. The physical pain of the branding was one thing, but the permanent stigma was another form of torture entirely. The food provided to enslaved people was barely enough to survive on, let alone thrive. Cato the Elder, a soldier and statesman from the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, wrote extensively about what agricultural enslaved people should receive. His writings reveal the absolute minimum Romans considered necessary to keep enslaved workers alive and functioning. According to Cato, enslaved people should get wheat to make their own bread. However, those shackled in chains, who couldn't grind grain themselves, received bread already made. During summer months when field work intensified, they received more flour and additional wine. After all, if you're forcing people to labor in scorching Mediterranean heat for no compensation, you need to keep them hydrated enough to continue working. Beyond bread and wine, enslaved people ate what Cato called relish, though this wasn't anything like the condiment you'd find at a modern barbecue. Roman relish consisted mainly of olives, not exactly a balanced diet. During the 1st century BC, enslaved people supplemented these meager rations by foraging for wild fruits and vegetables whenever they could steal moments away from their work. Some cultivated small crops on their own time, and those enslaved in urban households sometimes managed to grow tiny gardens. Domestic enslaved people also had the dubious privilege of eating whatever their masters didn't finish, picking through leftovers like scavengers. The psychological degradation of this must have been almost as painful as the physical hunger. While most enslaved people worked as forced laborers, some found themselves thrust into an even more terrifying role of gladiators. These fighters, made up largely of enslaved people alongside criminals and prisoners of war, first appeared in arenas as early as the 3rd century BC. One famous enslaved gladiator was Spartacus, who received training at one of Rome's gladiator schools. But if the idea of gladiator school sounds exciting or noble, think again. These weren't summer camps or martial arts academies. They were more like prisons where people were trained to fight and die for entertainment. Gladiators in training lived under conditions similar to prisoners, though they did receive food, medical care, and training with specialized weapons and techniques. But this wasn't kindness, it was simple economics. Trainers treated gladiators like investments rather than human beings. They avoided killing them too frequently because, as archaeologist Wolfgang Neuber pointed out, they were valuable assets. Interestingly, some formerly enslaved people actually volunteered to become gladiators after gaining their freedom. With such limited opportunities available to them after manumission, they essentially enslaved themselves again, swearing a gladiatorial oath to be burned by fire, bound by chains, beaten, and to die by the sword. That's an incredibly intense oath by any standard. But think about what it means that formerly enslaved people would voluntarily commit to these terms. The conditions facing freed people must have been absolutely terrible if fighting to the death in an arena seemed like a reasonable career option. This speaks volumes about Roman society's treatment of formerly enslaved people and the desperate economic straits they faced. The gladiatorial oath wasn't poetic language, it was a literal description of what they were signing up for, and they knew it. Urban and rural enslaved people shared at least one common experience. They lived in quarters deliberately separated from their masters and overseers. Domestic servants might sleep in their master's house, sometimes close enough to respond to nighttime demands. But there was always a clear effort to maintain physical and social distance between enslaved and free people. Enslaved people typically slept in rooms near storage areas, crowded together with others in similar situations. Imagine something like a bunk bed next to a garage except made of stone and wood, with minimal privacy or comfort. These sleeping arrangements reinforce their status as property rather than people. If you were enslaved in Rome, your wardrobe options were extremely limited and deliberately degrading. Enslaved people wore simple clothing barely distinguishable from what the poorest free people wore. Masters provided a tunic of 3.5 feet and a cloak once every 2 years. If you happened to have a long torso, you were simply out of luck. Also, you got one pair of decent shoes every 2 years. Imagine trying to make a single pair of shoes last that long, especially during an era before modern adhesives or repair techniques. When they wore out and you'd be walking around in rags on your feet. To add further humiliation to these practical deprivations, male enslaved people were specifically forbidden from wearing togas, the quintessential symbol of Roman citizenship and masculinity. Female enslaved people couldn't wear stolas, the dress that free women wore over their tunics. These clothing restrictions weren't just about economics, they were about maintaining visible social hierarchies. According to the philosopher Seneca, the Roman Senate once seriously considered requiring enslaved people to wear a specific uniform that would make them even more identifiable in public. They ultimately rejected this idea for a chilling reason: they didn't want enslaved people to realize exactly how many of them there were. The Senate feared that if enslaved people understood their true numbers, they might recognize their collective power. Why would the Roman Senate worry about enslaved people knowing their population? Because there were absolutely enormous numbers of them, truly staggering quantities. The sheer number of enslaved people in Roman society created constant tension and persistent fears about revolt among the free population. And Romans had good reason to be worried. Enslaved people were growing increasingly restless, and it was only a matter of time before minor rebellions escalated into major uprisings. Aside from countless small-scale resistance efforts and escape attempts, there was one particularly famous large-scale slave rebellion that genuinely threatened Roman society's stability. Remember Spartacus, the enslaved gladiator we discussed earlier? That same man grew up to lead one of the most significant slave revolts in ancient history. His rebellion eventually included around 70,000 enslaved people and supporters who took up arms against the Roman military. Those are absolutely serious numbers. This wasn't a small uprising but a genuine army. Spartacus and his forces fought the Roman military multiple times between 73 and 71 BC, defeating them in 3 separate engagements before finally being overwhelmed. According to historical sources, Spartacus fought courageously until the very end. Even after being wounded by a spear thrust in the thigh, he dropped to one knee, held his shield in front of him, and continued fighting off attackers until he and many of his followers were surrounded and killed. Although Spartacus and his army ultimately lost, their rebellion wasn't meaningless. The uprising sent shockwaves through Roman society and prompted genuine concerns about future revolts. These fears led to some legal reforms aimed at ensuring or at least encouraging better treatment of enslaved people. Lawmakers reasoned that if enslaved people were treated slightly less brutally, they might be less likely to rise up again. It was a cynical calculation rather than genuine moral progress, but it did result in some marginal improvements. The threat of another Spartacus was apparently more effective than appeals to basic human decency. And like many other historical slavery systems, Roman slavery wasn't based on race or ethnicity. Anyone could become enslaved, and the total number of enslaved people fluctuated wildly depending on Rome's military fortunes. After the Punic Wars during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, thousands upon thousands of people found themselves enslaved. Many became artisans, craftsmen, and agricultural laborers. As the empire continued expanding, Rome captured more and more prisoners of war, enslaving people from an increasingly diverse range of backgrounds. Greeks, Egyptians, North Africans, Gauls, and people from Asia Minor all found themselves trapped in Roman bondage. Rome was, in a grimly ironic sense, an equal opportunity enslaver. Female enslaved people weren't exempt from manual labor, but they often performed different kinds of personal service, particularly for elite and wealthy Roman women. They might be trained to apply cosmetics and style hair, functioning like an ancient beauty team who had no choice about being there and received no payment for their skilled work. Other female enslaved people served as wet nurses, breastfeeding the children of wealthy Roman women. This is perhaps one of the most intimate and exploitative forms of slavery imaginable, forcing women to nurse children who weren't their own while often being separated from their own babies. The sexual exploitation of enslaved people was horrifyingly common. Both female and male enslaved people could become victims of sexual abuse, and some masters even charged fees to allow others to assault their enslaved workers. This commercialization of sexual violence represents one of slavery's most depraved aspects. Surrounded by all this physical pain, psychological torture, and sexual exploitation, it's no wonder some enslaved people viewed the gladiator ring as a preferable alternative. At least there, they might die quickly rather than suffering slow degradation over decades. Slavery was absolutely fundamental to the Roman economy, touching virtually every aspect of daily life. However, there were different philosophical opinions about how enslaved people should be viewed and treated. The Stoics, most notably Seneca the Younger, wrote extensively about the relationship between enslaved people and masters. Seneca emphasized the fundamental humanity of enslaved people while also stressing the responsibility of masters to be kind and paternalistic. According to Seneca, an enslaved person came from the same origins, enjoys the same sky, and on equal terms with you breathes, lives, and dies. These were radical words in a society built on the premise that some humans were inherently property. Epictetus, himself a formerly enslaved person, lived and taught in Rome while advocating for fair treatment of enslaved people. He argued that enslaved people possessed nobility of spirit. But nobility isn't the same as freedom, and philosophical arguments didn't change the brutal material reality of slavery. One thing remains absolutely certain: any society that depends on enslaved labor is fundamentally unsustainable and unjust. It's worth noting that slavery persisted in the Roman Empire until its fall in 476 CE. The system didn't end because Romans collectively decided it was wrong, it ended because the entire civilization collapsed. The legacy of Roman slavery should remind us how easily societies can normalize horrific cruelty and exploitation. Free Romans walked past enslaved people every single day, benefited from their labor, and generally didn't question the system's morality. The philosophical voices calling for better treatment were exceptions, not the rule. Most Romans simply accepted slavery as a natural part of life, as inevitable as the weather. This should make us think critically about what injustices we might be normalizing in our own time, what suffering we might be ignoring because it's convenient or profitable. Understanding the brutal reality of Roman slavery also helps us appreciate how revolutionary the concept of universal human rights really is. The idea that every person, regardless of their circumstances, possesses inherent dignity and deserves freedom wasn't obvious to the Romans. It took centuries of struggle, countless rebellions and resistance movements, and fundamental shifts in philosophy and religion to establish this principle. Even today, various forms of modern slavery persist around the world, reminding us that the fight for human freedom is ongoing. The story of Roman slavery is ultimately about human resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Enslaved people in Rome found ways to resist, to maintain their humanity, to build families and communities despite the system designed to dehumanize them. They fought back when they could, like Spartacus and his followers. They preserved their dignity through small acts of resistance and mutual support. They survived, and their descendants eventually saw slavery's end. Their courage and endurance deserve to be remembered and honored. So, what do you think about the hardships faced by enslaved people in Rome? The subject is heavy, but it's important to confront these historical realities honestly. If you found this exploration valuable, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history's most fascinating and important topics. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts or suggesting what historical subjects you'd like to see covered next. Understanding the past helps us build a better future.